the condition of the hostages, how they're returned, the emotional release and what that does in Israeli society and psyche is going to be a huge determining factor about where the Israeli polity will vote on some of these issues. And that's going to be a determining factor about where the possible political space is and isn't.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. At long last, there is a ceasefire agreement in Gaza. The agreement, reached in the final days of the Biden administration, calls for the phased release of Israeli hostages held by Hamas and the release of a number of Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli jails. It calls for the redeployment of Israeli troops within Gaza and a surge of humanitarian aid to the Strip. Joining me to discuss the ceasefire details, why it was agreed just as the new Trump administration takes office, and what comes next is Joel Burnold, Managing Director of the S. Daniel Abraham Center for Middle East Peace. We kick off discussing the provisions of this ceasefire deal before having a longer conversation about how it may be implemented and what certain political and diplomatic changes over the next several months mean for the future of this deal and the broader prospects of a lasting peace in the region. So this is our first episode of the new Trump 2.0 era. And I just want to say to you at the outset that this is going to be a challenging time for multilateralism, internationalism, and a lot of the issues that I have reported on for many, many years. And I suspect the issues that you, if you're listening to this show, deeply care about and are concerned for. So I just want to tell you that I plan to be here with you every step of the way, helping you make sense of this new era of international politics. Thank you for being with me for so many years, and thank you for sticking with me in this unpredictable era to come. If you want to support my work, and I really hope you will, please visit globaldispatches.org and get a paid subscription. It really helps me profoundly, each and every one of these paid subscriptions that I'm able to convert from a passive podcast listener to an active supporter of this show and of my work. So thank you. And I'll post a link to globaldispatches.org in the show notes of this episode. Now, here is my conversation with Joel Burnold, Managing Director of the S. Daniel Abraham Center for Middle East Peace. So, Joel, we are speaking on Friday, January 17th. The Israeli cabinet has approved formally the ceasefire deal. Just to kick off, can I have you explain what is in this deal? What are its key provisions that listeners should know?
The hostage prisoner exchange ceasefire deal is really a three-stage deal that President Biden and his team put together back in May. And the deal that was agreed to was hammered out in Qatar. And the one that they just approved is really the first stage of that deal. And the deal basically has, for the next 6 weeks, there'll be a series of hostage releases and prisoner exchanges and a cessation of military activity with some Israeli forces withdrawal to certain moving Israeli forces eastwards away from populated parts of the Gaza Strip, and redeployments and rearranging where the Israelis are currently situated on the Philadelphia corridor and reopening the Rafah border crossing, an ability for wounded civilians, Palestinian civilians, to exit through the Rafah crossing, a return of displaced Palestinians from northern the northern part of the Gaza Strip to go back up to the Gaza Strip, and a surge of humanitarian aid. So it's for the next 6 weeks, those things happen. And throughout those 6 weeks, as long as it continues and neither side breaks the deal, there should be, starting on day 16, negotiations about moving to phase 2, which goes to the permanent cessation of the military activities. And that phase 2 there's a big question about whether that will happen. But the first stage of the deal should release around 50 Israeli hostages, but not captured men of military age. So it leaves around half of the hostages inside during this first phase. And the hope is that there'll be enough momentum to be able to get to a second phase.
So by the time people are listening to this episode, say the week of January 20th, what will you be looking towards that will suggest to you whether or not the provisions of this agreement are actually being met and being realized?
Well, in this first week, if this is released next week, we're going to see this macabre experience that we only really saw last November, where every day a few hostages will be released back into Israel. And in return, Israel will start releasing Gazan detainees and long-term Palestinian prisoners, including those serving life sentences and who have blood on their hands for each of these hostages. So in each case, it's sort of a trust and verify. 3 hostages come out, prisoners are released, more hostages come out, prisoners are released. And so you'll see this ongoing situation moving over the next sort of week or two. And this creates a significant emotional drama and burden in both societies. In Israel, there's a huge question about, especially whether the Bibas family are alive. Some of the most prominent hostages that are supposed to be released is a 9-month-old baby who was taken, Kfir Bibas, his 4-year-old sibling, and then their parents. And there's a real question about whether they're alive or dead. Hamas has not said if they're alive or dead, and they should be released on the second day of the ceasefire agreement, so on Monday. And should they be alive, I think there'll be a lot of celebration. Should they sadly be dead, the emotional torrent that will rock Israel and what could happen, in my view, has a real chance about disrupting the ongoing releases, given the emotional torment that that's going to create and the pressure that that could create. And this is the challenge of Hamas not telling the Israelis who's alive or dead, and no one in the population having the ability to prepare themselves. So you're going to see this over the next 2 weeks, and that's going to dominate the headlines. Starting on day 16, there's supposed to be the beginning of the negotiations about how this can be extended further. And Mark, I think it's very important that people understand that phase 2 isn't really delineated that much. I'm actually going to read you the official text of phase 2 that came out, and I can read it because it's not very long. The second stage, which is supposed to last another 42 days after the first stage, just says, announce restoration of sustainable calm, which is the cessation of military operations and hostilities permanently, and its commencement prior to the exchange of hostages and prisoners between the two sides, all remaining Israeli hostages who are living men, civilians and soldiers, in exchange for a number of prisoners in Israeli prisons and detention centers, and the complete withdrawal of Israeli forces from the Gaza Strip. That's stage 2. So what you've seen in Israel is Netanyahu, through spokespeople and others, making commitments saying, look, we have really strong demands in phase 2. We're not going to leave Philadelphia. We're going to be part of the border zone of Gaza. We're not going to, abandon all the different parts. And if Hamas doesn't agree to all of our terms, then they've broken the deal and we can go back to the war. And so there's going to be tremendous pressure, A, on Hamas to get with the program, and B, on Israel to negotiate in good faith. And I think that the hope is that the momentum of the potential to release the remaining hostages, and that the guarantors of the agreement, which are Egypt and Qatar and the US, will put pressure on the parties to negotiate in good faith. But that's really a very tough nut to crack. And if you listen to incoming Trump administration officials, whether that's the incoming national security advisor, Mr. Waltz, who said that, Hamas will not be able to govern the territory and Israel has a right to ensure that. If you listen to others, Hamas is going to have to make some serious compromises that they haven't made in order to ensure that the second stage happens. And Israel is also going to have to negotiate in good faith. And Bibi might have to risk another party in his coalition dropping out should the war not continue. And so the crunch time comes after 42 days. But in the meantime, there'll be this emotional roller coaster of the hostages being released and prisoners being released.
So I do want to get into the politics and diplomacy of all this in a minute, but I do, though, for now, just want to kind of focus on these next 42 days. And if things go according to plan, what does that look like? So you mentioned the cadence of hostages being released and Palestinian prisoners being freed from Israeli jails. There's also this question, and you've mentioned it twice, of where exactly Israeli soldiers can be deployed within the Gaza Strip. And you've mentioned the Philadelphia corridor as being a particular flashpoint. Could you just explain what that is to listeners, and what, if the provisions of the deal are abided by, like what that means in terms of where Israeli soldiers can be and what their conduct can be within Gaza?
So we don't know exactly where the redeployments are going to be. The maps haven't been released, but the mediators have them and assumably have been shared with both sides. One of the delays in the deal just after it was announced was a question about where these redeployments would be. The Philadelphia crossing is the strip of land that separates Egypt and Gaza. The Rafah border crossing is the crossing between Gaza and Egypt. And in the past, the Philadelphia crossing has been a place where a lot of smuggling has happened and where many of the weapons that got into the Gaza Strip, that's how they got in there. In May, when the Biden administration was trying to solve some of these problems, Prime Minister Netanyahu had said that the Philadelphia crossing basically is his red line and that we will never leave the Philadelphia crossing, as in Israel, and that this had the potential to completely disrupt the situation. And so in the first phase, it seems that Israel has agreed to redeploy some troops in parts of the Philadelphia crossing, and assumably they're going to reopen the Rafah crossing. After Israel invaded Rafah, the Rafah border crossing closed because the Egyptians weren't willing to reopen it if the Israelis were on the other side of the border. And so there needs to be a solution to about how the Rafah crossing can open. Now, Hamas can't be operating the crossing. So the question is who's going to operate the crossing on the other side? There's been huge amounts of negotiations. There's an EU mission called EU BAM that was supposed to run the crossing since '05. But in general, it's the Palestinian Authority that's supposed to be running the crossing. But the Israelis, who don't want to give, at this point, the PA the ability to come back into Gaza, have objected to the PA running it. And there's been a huge amalgamation of questions and how do we ensure that the Egyptians are happy with who's running the other side of the crossing, because you need the crossing open to surge humanitarian assistance and to evacuate injured Palestinian civilians. So it would appear from looking at reports yesterday that there has been a delegation from Ramallah that have gone to Cairo, and there's frantic negotiations about working out who's going to operate the Rafah crossing in the meantime. Will Israel secure the crossing in the same way that it secures, for example, the Allenby crossing between the West Bank and Jordan, where the Palestinian Authority runs the actual crossing, but there's an Israeli security blanket as well, so there's double checks. How are they going to do that? These are all technical things that assumably are being worked out right now. But that's why Philadelphia's been so important. But the ceasefire should be ceasefire, but I'm assuming that the Israeli troops, as they move into their positions, are not exiting the Gaza Strip in its totality in the first phase. And as civilians move from south to north of the Gaza Strip, it says unarmed civilians. So how that's monitored and how that works is going to be open to conversation. And one of the big questions is, should there be testing of the ceasefire early? How does that look? And, which side blinks first? And Hamas is very incentivized to make sure this goes off without a hitch. The Israelis want their hostages back. And so the assumption is for the first 42 days, they are also incentivized to make sure that this goes off without a hitch. But it's going to be very tough and very complicated.
And part of this first phase deal is also a surge in humanitarian aid into Gaza. And presumably that could be just like easily measured, right, by the number of trucks that are entering Gaza on any given day. Do you foresee there to be complications or hiccups on that side of the ceasefire deal?
Well, according to the ceasefire deal as it was published, the 8th section that deals with humanitarian aid simply reads, humanitarian aid procedures under the agreement will be done subject to the humanitarian protocol agreed upon the supervision of the mediators. So it's not public. My assumption is that someone's checking the trucks to make sure that things coming in and out. But the reason that humanitarian aid dipped so significantly in the recent months was because the Rafah crossing has been closed and everything's had to come through Israeli crossing points. In addition, there's been lawlessness and the
Yeah.
trucks have been looted and everything else. So my assumption is at the mediation table, there's been lots of conversations about how the humanitarian aid will be surged. My assumption is most of it will come through Rafah and how that will look. But, there's a provision of how many tents and other things in the May agreement, which this one references. There was counting of 60,000 tents, questions about rehabilitation of infrastructure, roads, removal of rubble, entry of supplies and requirements, no less than 60,000 temporary homes and caravans, and 2,000 tents. So there's a lot of technical stuff, and so there shouldn't be too many barriers to this. Though in the Israeli cabinet conversations, it was reported that Netanyahu was making deals with his finance minister Smotrich on some of the humanitarian issues. So I'm not really sure how that's going to work, but we wait to see.
So this deal largely mirrors and references a deal that was first put on the table in May by the Biden administration, subsequently endorsed by the Security Council. So this deal has been in the air, in the offing for several months at this point. Why now, days before the Trump administration takes office, do you suspect that the sides finally, at this point, at long last, agreed to a ceasefire deal and hostage release?
So you can look at this in three different places. So let's firstly look at it from the Israeli perspective. A lot's happened since May. Israel decapitated and destroyed Hezbollah. The government in Syria has collapsed. They've had various rounds with Iran. And they've also been doing increasing military activity in Gaza. Now, since that point, 6 prominent hostages were executed. 2 more seemingly died, potentially in Israeli airstrikes. And over 100 soldiers have also been killed in Gaza since then. So there's a different situation in Israel than it was before. On the Hamas side, Yechiel Sinwar has been killed, and now his brother Mohammed Sinwar is there. Also, they've really lost a lot of their allies in terms of Hezbollah and others, and they're in a weaker position as well. So you could look at it and claim that there's a change of circumstance between the parties and everything else. But the most obvious reason that most people are looking at is that you've had a change in US administrations, and that President Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, went to the region and basically told all the parties, Israel included, that President Trump wants a deal by the time he's inaugurated. And if you don't do this, he will publicly call you out that you're the responsible party, and that the all hell will break loose is contingent on everyone, the mediators, the parties involved. And that they realized you don't want to start off a new 4-year presidency of a very strong re-elected president on his bad side. And that was what was needed to get the oomph over it.
Well, can I just stop you there? I mean, to what extent do you think that's an indictment on the Biden administration's approach that, this was Biden's plan back in May, but he couldn't get it across the finish line because he didn't threaten to knock heads and, frankly, to many observers, put sufficient pressure on Netanyahu to accept this deal?
You can read it very much that way. I'm not going to deny that that's definitely a reading. Look, Biden and Trump are just 2 radically different people. President Trump has this unique ability that he can outflank anyone to their right, including Prime Minister Netanyahu. He's got this unstable ability that people don't know which way he's going to do, but everyone believes that he's in their corner. So the Israelis can tell themselves a story that, if we do this, Trump will side with us on annexation, or Trump will side with us on bombing Iran. And that even though it was Joe Biden who built the military alliance to stop Iran bombing them before and everything else, that Trump will be better for us because traditionally he was better for us and therefore we'll have more belief in him. So you could say that even if Joe Biden had put pressure on Netanyahu and said, I'm going to stop weapons, that's not the pressure if you listen to what Trump did. Trump's not threatening to stop giving Israel weapons or anything else. It's just that the Israelis understand that his unpredictability could also apply to him, and they have no idea what that could mean when it comes to Iran or Syria or Lebanon or anything else, or what it could mean for lots of different things. Whereas Joe Biden's predictability means that they knew where his red lines are, that even as much as they say no to him, he's not going to do certain things that would be against their interest because he's very predictable and they know how he assesses the world. And so in many ways, Joe Biden was disadvantaged by that, when it came to the Israelis, who knew very much how to play that. Whereas with President Trump, they have no idea how to play him. They really don't. And the reports of the Witkoff meeting that President Trump himself shared on Truth Social was that it was a very tough meeting. And, he speaks with the voice of the president. I'd also say, Mark, structurally, President Trump fully empowered his envoy to speak on his behalf. They knew that speaking to Steve Witkoff was the equivalent of speaking to President Donald Trump. It doesn't matter what good relationships they might have with anyone else in Trump orbit, Witkoff was speaking with his voice. President Biden never appointed an envoy with that amount of leverage or power at any point. And so one of the difficulties of having everyone doing everything, you had 6 different principals running around trying to do this, is that no one speaks with that level of authority. And there's a benefit of having someone speak with that level of authority.
Yeah, I mean, on the Biden administration side, you had like the CIA director playing the role of like what conventionally would be a Secretary of State doing a lot of shuttle diplomacy. Then you had Amos Hochstein, a special envoy, and then you had the State Department. So I do take your point there.
If you have everyone doing everything, in my view, you have no one doing anything. But look, the reason that Steve Witkoff could put the pressure on to get the deal is because there was a deal in place. Mm-hmm. And look, Mr. Witkoff, has previously said that Qatar was doing God's work and that he's had previous relationships with the Kingdom of Qatar. And, in many ways, that frightens the Israelis and the pro-Israeli camp because they've tried to show that Qatar are the villains of this piece. And Mr. Witkoff found a deal, was briefed by the parties, worked hand in glove with Brett McGurk to get this done. And it seems didn't really adjust any of the major contours of the deal, just put pressure in order to get it done because his mandate from his boss was to get this done by Inauguration Day. And he did.
You mentioned this briefly, but I think it's worth emphasizing how just profoundly the kind of geopolitical circumstances and diplomatic circumstances for Hamas have changed since May. You had Hezbollah and Israel agreed to a ceasefire, which took some pressure off. You have Iran seriously on its back foot in its conflict with Israel, plus like all the decapitation strikes against Hamas and frankly Hezbollah that you referenced earlier. So they are also seemingly in a much weaker position as well, and also are therefore incentivized to come to the table. So you have that and the dissolution of the Assad regime as well. I'd add to that mix. So you have all that, plus the incoming Trump administration. It seems that the political circumstances have shifted in a way that made this deal come together at this moment.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think what's interesting is if you look at reports, it seems that the Trump administration has told the Israelis that they want the ceasefire with Lebanon to hold. The 60-day ceasefire there in terms of to see what's been going on expires in 7 days, but it seems like the Trump administration does not want to see new wars kicked off. Listening to Marco Rubio's hearing, he seems more open to lifting sanctions on the new Syrian regime and looking about how to give that a chance. And so the Israelis find themselves that during the Biden administration, they were seen as one of the main, if not the main US ally, especially in the Levant as things were sort of collapsing and going around. They come into a Trump world where the Qataris are ascendant, the Turks, have their own good relationships with the Trump administration. The Trump administration wants to see Lebanon succeed. They want to see Syria succeed. They don't want to see those things go back into chaos. And they want there to try and be a normalization deal with Saudi, who have their own demands on the Palestinian file. So Israel now is one amongst many different allies in the region who have the administration's ear and their freedom of action in order to threaten, the stability of some of these new regimes is limited because the Trump administration doesn't want to see chaos in the Middle East kick off right at the beginning. President Trump wants to be a peace president. He says it constantly. That doesn't mean that we're going to an Arab peace initiative or Oslonian format and the Palestinians' aspirations should be sized into the deal of the century, because that's probably where the Trump administration is going to start when it looks on the Palestinian file, using normalization with the Saudis as the critical part. But the Israelis' freedom of action to dictate around the region counterintuitively might be lessened under Trump than it was under Biden, just given the realities of Trump's desire for there not to be chaos in the region. And how that actually also affects with the Iranians is also a big question. Trump does not want to see Iran get a nuclear weapon and wants to severely limit their ability to have resources in order to pursue that goal or to support armed groups around, but would he be open to a deal that could do that, that wouldn't look at the regime change? Well,
Yeah.
listening to Trump folks, that's seemingly where they're going to go. And how does that apply to the Israelis and where the Saudis' relationship with Iran is? I think we're in a completely new game. And Hamas is definitely weakened in terms of its regional allies. And I think it's now impinging on Israel to do one of the things that it's really struggled to do, which is to offer its own plan, both for Gaza and for the West Bank, about what it wants to see. And it's going to need to make those decisions, because if it doesn't create its own plan, there's a feeling that the region might try and bring its own desires about what might happen there and present it to the Trump administration, and Israel will be left on a responsive foot rather than a proactive foot.
That leads me to my last question, which is potentially the trickiest, which is how do you approach the longer term question, assuming phase one succeeds? How do you approach the longer term question of who controls, who manages, who runs Gaza?
So, Secretary of State Blinken decided, for some reason, which I still don't particularly understand, to reveal the US day after plan for Gaza like 3 days ago in a speech to the Atlantic Council. Everyone was focused on Doha, and I personally was worried that it could upset the Doha talks. It didn't, but I don't know why, but he could have just handed that off to the Trump administration without revealing it, but he did. He laid out certain expectations, and it's not really new stuff, which was basically that Abraham Accord countries in the region would create some sort of international body and would be invited in by the Palestinian Authority to help secure the Gaza Strip and help rehabilitate it. And once it's in a sustainable, strong setting and the PA has gone through its own reforms, that Gaza would be handed back over to the PA. Every sort of understanding about what could happen in Gaza basically revolves around those same things. The challenge is this: Hamas has to agree in some regards to either be self-exiled, a la Lebanon agreements from the 80s. It has to agree that some of the lower level people might have to reintegrate into a new Palestinian something and, give up their weapons and have one person, one gun. And that there could be some joint committee that might have international oversight with a UN mandate to oversee running it. And that's how it's going to have to move forward. If not that, then you might have a UN trusteeship, though I doubt that. And if not that, you could have sort of what's been termed Mogadishu on the sea, just sort of chaos.
Mogadishu is also on the sea, for the record.
Oh, okay. So, yeah. So, exactly.
Another Mogadishu.
So let me just say, Mogadishu on the Mediterranean.
There you go.
So there you go. So you could do it that way. Look, these are all very tough problems. There's been dozens of plans presented by think tanks and other groups and tries to go forward. I think the real motivating factor comes down to this. The Trump administration doesn't want to make deals with Hamas and doesn't want to see Hamas be empowered. And so someone else needs to be there. You need to have Palestinian-led governance. The Israelis have left a crack in the door open for the PA if they go through substantial, significant reforms. That starts with prisoner payment reform and education reform. But even then, that's a long-term process, and how that will be verified. And, they're thinking maybe private military contractors go in, because everything for them starts with internal security. Once you've got internal security, everything can flow from that. So who's going to stand up to Hamas gunmen? Who's going to eject them? And if no one's going to eject them, then they're going to have to do it. And that's a real central point about how do you crack that open. But Mark, I'd say the real motivating factor for the Israelis and for the Trump team is that there is this desire that existed throughout the second part of the Biden administration to solidify normalization with Saudi Arabia. And for the Saudis, they've been clear there are two requirements. One, the war in Gaza must stop. And that means you can't have tanks in Khan Yunis, right? So someone's going to have to be there if it's not the Israelis. And secondly, they want a credible pathway to the bigger Palestinian statehood question. Doesn't mean there has to be a state tomorrow. Doesn't mean that it comes at the end of the agreement between the Israelis and Palestinians. But there has to be a credible, whether it's irreversible or time-bound, these things might be negotiable and everything else, there has to be a credible process. And so those requirements don't just magically disappear because the Trump administration's in and the Biden administration's gone. And the Israelis are going to have to face that reality. And when an Israeli election happens, should that be this year, or if magically Netanyahu squares another circle and pulls another rabbit out of his hat that lasts to 2026. One of the big questions of the Israeli election, for the first time arguably since 2000, is going to be on the Palestinian issue. And going back to the beginning of this conversation, the condition of the hostages, how they're returned, the emotional release and what that does in Israeli society and psyche is going to be a huge determining factor about where the Israeli polity will vote on some of these issues. And that's going to be a determining factor about where the possible political space is and isn't. So a lot of is wait to be seen in these next 6 weeks are going to be really important and indicative for a lot of these sort of conversations.
Well, Joel, as always, I really appreciate your time. Love learning for you. Thank you for suffering through this conversation while dealing with the flu. I really appreciate it.
No, thanks, Mark, for having me on. And we should all have grace. This has been a traumatic, massive time for the Israelis and Palestinians. And the task of how Humpty Dumpty is put back together again is unfathomably difficult at this point, not just from a political policy level, but from a pure human level as well.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.